It's 6 p.m. on a Thursday here in Korea. Welcome to our newscast. I'm Daniel Che. Let's begin with the headlines. The leaders of South Korea and the U.S. vowed to work closely to seek the strongest and most comprehensive sanctions against North Korea during a phone conversation earlier today. South Korean ministries, including Foreign Affairs and Defense, filed emergency progress reports on the steps they are taking to counter Pyongyang. The UN Security Council quickly got to work following Pyongyang's latest provocation. The 15-member body denounced the regime and plans to impose additional sanctions. We start with the reaction from the nation's top office to North Korea's fourth nuclear test. President Park Geun-hye and U.S. President Barack Obama reaffirmed their bilateral alliance and agreed to work together toward comprehensive UN sanctions against North Korea. For more, let's turn to our Song Ji-sun at the presidential office of Cheongwade. Ji-sun, we hear the two leaders talked about pushing for the strongest sanctions yet against North Korea.
Yes, Daniel, President Park Geun-hye spoke with U.S. President Barack Obama this morning to discuss countermeasures and respond to the threats coming from North Korea. The phone call made by President Obama took place at 9:55 a.m. Thursday, Seoul time. During their 20-minute conversation, the two leaders, President Obama reiterated that North Korea's nuclear tests pose a threat to regional security and stressed that the U.S. will do everything necessary to ensure the security of its allies, including South Korea. The two leaders agreed that Pyongyang has violated its denuclearizing commitment with this latest nuclear test, both by going against UN resolutions barring the North from a nuclear test, and with the six-party talks, the multilateral dialogue aimed at denuclearizing Pyongyang that has been stalled since 2008. President Obama said Washington would seek the strongest and most comprehensive sanctions against Pyongyang at the UN, and said the U.S. would work closely with South Korea to that end. The two leaders also vowed closer trilateral ties with Japan and acknowledged the need to collaborate further with China in dealing with the North Korea's nuclear issues. They also renewed their commitments to address the North Korean nuclear issue with the utmost urgency, as they had at their summit talks in October last year. Before hanging up, President Obama also expressed his support for the recent agreement on Japan's wartime sexual enslavement of South Korean women, and that the agreement will strengthen the allies' efforts to counter North Korea's nuclear threats. President Park also spoke on the phone with Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe this afternoon for about 15 minutes just before 5 p.m. But details on that conversation are yet to be released. I'm Song Ji-sun reporting live from the presidential office of Cheongwade.
All right, thank you for that, Ji-sun. And this just in, following another National Security Council meeting this afternoon, the South Korean government has announced it will resume its loudspeaker propaganda broadcast on the inter-Korean border starting at noon on Friday. Moving on, the National Assembly's Foreign Affairs, Unification and Defense Committees adopted a resolution today condemning the North's recent nuclear test. Shin Se-min tells us more.
North Korea's unexpected nuclear test on Wednesday kept South Korea's cabinet ministers busy on Thursday, with a number of them reporting to the parliament to give emergency progress reports. Defense Minister Han Min-gu denounced the test, calling it a clear violation of an agreement between the two Koreas struck in August last year.
Our military is fully prepared to counter North Korea and will do everything in our capacity to keep North Korea from launching future provocations.
Seoul's foreign ministry also called the test a provocation and vowed to ensure North Korea does not develop its nuclear arsenal any further.
Through bilateral or multilateral cooperation with the international community, we will make sure the North pays for its actions of violating the stability in the region through the nuclear test.
The resolution says the South Korean parliament will cooperate with the international community to resolve the North Korea nuclear issue. It also says South Korea will be at the forefront of efforts to denuclearize North Korea. The National Assembly is expected to vote on Friday, the last day of its extraordinary session, on a resolution denouncing the North for its fourth nuclear test that have threatened the peace and stability on Korean Peninsula. Shin Se-min, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, the defense chiefs of South Korea and the United States have released a joint statement reaffirming their alliance and commitment to countering Pyongyang's nuclear ambitions. We will be talking about possible rediscussions on that as well, and big guns will be carried in from the U.S. to South Korea to bolster defense postures. We turn to our Kim Yeon-bin for the latest.
In a statement, South Korea's Defense Minister Han Min-gu and U.S. Secretary of Defense Ashton Carter called the incident a direct violation of international law, as well as a threat to peace and stability not only on the Korean peninsula, but in the Asia-Pacific region.
Secretary Carter reaffirmed the U.S.'s ironclad defense commitment to South Korea, and this includes all kinds of extended deterrence assets.
The two had spoken by phone late Wednesday. Han said Thursday the two countries are planning to strengthen and enhance their joint military exercises and operations against North Korea's nuclear and missile threats. This is known as the 4D plan: detect, disrupt, destroy, and defend.
South Korea and the U.S. will maintain close cooperation on Pyongyang's recent nuclear test, and we are setting up measures to counter future provocations.
Meanwhile, diplomatic sources in Washington told Seoul-based Yonhap news agency that Wednesday's nuclear test by the North will lead Seoul to strengthen its nuclear deterrent to counter Pyongyang's growing nuclear threats. South Korea currently relies on the U.S. nuclear umbrella after Washington withdrew its nuclear weapons from the peninsula in the early 1990s. Seoul's defense ministry says that the deployment of U.S. tactical weaponry is now being discussed. Every time North Korea conducts a nuclear test, and there have been three, one in 2006, 2009, and 2013. It has raised calls for the U.S. to redeploy tactical weaponry to the peninsula. But each time the idea has been dismissed as a non-starter by both governments. Experts say the missile defense system known as THAAD, or Terminal High Altitude Area Defense, could now be on the table, along with B-52 bombers and F-22 Raptor stealth fighter jets. Kim Yeon-bin, Arirang News.
Rapid response from the global community. The UN Security Council has been united in its condemnation of North Korea's latest provocative and dangerous act. Seoul's Foreign Affairs Ministry says it is hoping for an appropriate new UN resolution, which is expected to be adopted this month. Kwon So-hwa has this report.
It was a quick response by the United Nations Security Council. After their 2-hour emergency meeting in New York on Wednesday, the 15-member Security Council denounced Pyongyang's claim to have tested a hydrogen bomb.
The members of the Security Council strongly condemned this test, which is a clear violation of Security Council resolutions and of the non-proliferation regime, and therefore a clear threat to international peace and security continues to exist.
The last time the Security Council adopted the resolution 2013, in its resolution, Security Council expressed its determination to take further significant measures in the event of a further DPRK launch or nuclear test.
And those additional measures are expected to be in the form of new sanctions on Pyongyang, on top of the existing ones for its 3 previous nuclear tests and other provocations, such as its long-range rocket launches. According to an official at Seoul's Foreign Affairs Ministry, this could include enforcing trade, financial, or other economic sanctions on individuals or entities. But he added that at this point, it's too early to make any additional predictions, as the Security Council meeting was held behind closed doors, and Korea, which is not a member, can only consult with the other members, but cannot negotiate.
No matter what North Korea's aim is, under no circumstances will the international community tolerate it as a nuclear weapons state. That is why it's important for the UN to respond accordingly, so the North pays a price for its provocations.
When asked about the timing of the next UN Security Council meeting, an official at the ministry said it's most likely going to be on the day the new resolution is adopted. And his cautious prediction was for that to happen this month. Kwon So-hwa, Arirang News.
North Korea's latest provocation is set to spur changes in policies against the regime in countries around the world, especially the U.S. Joining us on the line is to provide us with some insights is Professor William Tao from the Department of International Relations, School of International Political and Strategical Studies, Australian National University, College of Asia and the Pacific. Thank you for joining us, Professor Tao.
No worries. Glad to discuss things with you.
Well, first of all, let's start with some possible conspiracy theories from some pundits. They say the reclusive state may have targeted the next presidential election in the U.S. to take place later this year. What do you think about this theory?
Not much. The Republican candidates really haven't applied themselves very forcefully to thinking about Northeast Asian security at this particular juncture. This morning, Donald Trump, the leading candidate, in an interview with Wolf Blitzer at CNN, advanced something which was called the Trump Doctrine, in which he indicated that China is really the key to resolving the North Korean situation. But at the same time, Trump indicated that U.S. national security capabilities would have to be strengthened. So he's playing both ends against the middle. The other Republican candidates really haven't come out with anything very extensive in public to date addressing the Korean Peninsula, although obviously Wednesday's nuclear test will prompt more thinking and public debate about that.
Well, there doesn't seem to be much when it comes to North Korea policies for the U.S. Sanctions and more aggressive ignorance towards ignoring North Korea's claims. That seems to be the U.S.'s stance. But do we see any changes in terms of U.S.'s policy towards North Korea from this point on?
Obviously, the Americans are going to want to investigate working with China as much as possible. I think there's a general consensus in Washington that they're going to have to move more in step with coordinating a joint policy with the Chinese, if at all possible, because China, of course, has the most leverage on the Pyongyang regime. The problem, of course, is what the U.S. is going to be able to give China in return for greater Chinese cooperation. China certainly does not want to see a unified Korea, which is pro-Western, is a U.S. ally on its borders. So this is going to be a long-term strategic set of negotiations, and you're not going to see any short-term or quick solution to these sorts of things.
Right, China holds the power, but it's hard to slowly and gently persuade them to change their ways. Moving on, Professor, how will cooperation between South Korea and the U.S. change in the future after this fourth nuclear test from North Korea?
Well, I think someone in your newscast a moment ago mentioned the THAAD missile defense system, and I think this is going to be front and center. I think there will also be greater attention to hardening bases in Guam and other complexes where in some type of future Northeast Asian contingency, U.S. strike assets are going to be essentially used from these particular places. The problem with this, of course, is that the Chinese may look at this as being directed as much towards the South China Sea as towards Northeast Asia. So again, it comes back to the same premise, which is the Americans and Chinese are really going to have to sit down and have a series of hard strategic discussions about what interests they may have in common to realize greater strategic stability in the area, the whole Asia-Pacific area.
One last question before we go. Will it make it any easier for the U.S. to transfer technologies, key technologies, because we had been having some trouble in terms of getting the technology transfer for fighter jet programs in Korea? Very shortly, Professor.
Yeah, the short answer is no, because the U.S. Congress has a strong track record of being highly discriminate towards even solid allies such as South Korea on these particular issues. So I don't think that Wednesday's test was enough to prompt a wholesale revision of congressional sentiment in this regard.
Okay, Professor William Tao, thank you so much for your time.
No problem.
The Chinese stock market pulled the plug on trading again for the second time in just 3 days after the CSI 300 index plunged more than 7% on Thursday, closing off the markets after a brief 30-minute session. Key shares dropped 5% when the market first opened, tripping a circuit breaker suspension for 15 minutes, but the selling picked straight up again, triggering a halt on trade for the rest of the day. This comes after a surprise depreciation of the yuan from the People's Bank of China, which set the daily yuan-dollar guidance rate 0.5% weaker than the previous day, the target weakening margin since August last year. The sell-off on the market is said to have stemmed from concerns that the yuan will slide further and set off fresh concerns about the health of the world's second largest economy. The World Bank has cut its forecast for the global economy this year to 2.9% due to weakness in developing economies. Its prior estimate made just last June was 3.3%, and the global economy advanced 2.4% in 2015. According to the World Bank's biannual Global Economic Prospects reports released on Wednesday, developing countries are expected to collectively grow 4.8% this year, up from a 6-year low of 4.3% last year. However, the bank warned a slowdown in several major emerging economies, including China and Brazil, may have sizable spillovers on other developing economies. Economic growth is forecast to enter the 3% range in 2017. The U.S. Federal Reserve's decision to raise interest rates last month was a close call, according to minutes from the December meeting. According to central bank documents released Wednesday, although the vote to raise rates was unanimous, some committee members believe economic conditions would warrant only gradual increases in the future and emphasize a need to, quote, avoid appearing to commit to any specific pace of adjustments. The minutes also indicative of the central bank's concern about low inflation of below the Fed's annual target of 2%. In announcing the rate hike last month, Fed Chairman Janet Yellen said she was confident the target would be met and that the global factors would not derail the U.S. economy. And that brings us to the end of our newscast. As always, thank you for watching.